Hello everybody, my name is Simon Mamuya from School of Public Health and Social Sciences of Muhimbili University. I am a senior lecturer in the Department of Environment and Occupational Health. Our topic today will be Introduction to Disasters. Welcome. In this topic, the outline will be first the concept and definition of disasters. Then we will try to see what are the classification of disasters. From there, we will try to outline the consequences, especially the public health consequences of disasters. And lastly, we will review the disaster risk reduction as outlined by Hyogo Framework for Action. What does the term disaster means to you? I'm quite sure everyone knows what is that. Everyone has encountered disaster in his lifetime. Maybe yesterday, maybe some 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago. Disasters. It is a serious disruption of function of a community or a society which causing a wide spread of human, material, economic, environmental. All these are losses. And these losses exceeded the ability of the affected community or that society to cope using their own resources. And in this aspect, it involves the emergencies. It does not warn anyone when it comes, disasters. It means that it comes without showing. It is an extraordinary measure taken in order to avert. So it is emergency situation, emergency state. When you take of disaster, we have said that it is that which causes losses to human, to material, to environment, that exceeded. But the key factors which are disasters, there are 3 or 4. These are risks because their probability of happening, and that risk, the risk of disaster, is depend on the hazard that what cause harm and vulnerability. But the capacity is another important. The situation which explain the disasters, the relationship is that disaster risk is the function of hazard times vulnerability minus capacity. This means that if with a higher hazard, the hazard is proportional to the magnitude of the risk. Vulnerability as well. The higher the vulnerability the community is, the higher the vulnerability the material is, the higher the vulnerable the environment is, the higher the risk. That capacity, with more capacity, capacity to avert, capacity to resolve, means that disaster risk is equal to hazard times vulnerability, either capacity. In some books you can see like this, and this means that if you have capacity, the more capacity you have, the lesser the effect of the disaster to a certain community, to a certain environment, to a certain society, and to the economy as well. So this is a very important relationship which everyone should take into consideration. So in order to reduce the risk, in order to reduce this disaster risk, either you work with the hazard, or you work with vulnerability. But now we will see what are the components of hazard and then a component of vulnerabilities, and to see whether we have enough capacity to cope with the disaster risks. And I'm quite sure in developing countries where we are living with less than $1 a day, we don't have the capacity. So this, it is equipped, that zero, so is very high. Disaster risk is very high that's why it's very high in developing countries. That's why it's very high for poor people. Having demonstrated the important equation in the disaster, we have seen that a hazard is a threatening event or potentially damaging incidents. And I'm quite sure you have encountered this. One can say rain can be a hazard. Fire is a hazard. We have so many hazards. Hurricane is a hazard. There are so many hazards. But what is the disaster? Hurricane by itself, it cannot kill anybody. Flood as it is, it cannot do anything. It can go to the sea, ocean. But when it reaches the vulnerability is when it causes problem. But what is the risk? The risk is the probability of suffering damage to life, property, to economic disruption and environment from a hazard for a given or a reference period. So risk is the product of hazard and vulnerability. And when you look at the vulnerability, now that is where we can dwell. That is where we can think of. Because that is susceptibility of physical, emotional injury following a disaster. Or in other words, is a degree to which an area, people, physical structure, economic asset are exposed to loss, injury, or damage caused by the impact of a hazard. As we have said earlier, that in most of the developing countries, the capacity is very, very low, is almost nothing, so it's called a zero. Because these are resources available to cope with the threat. If the resource to cope with the threat is not available, or to resist the impact of hazard, definitely you have to dwell on vulnerability. So it is clear there are different options which we can demonstrate that. Now, let's come to see what are the classification of these disasters. Some disasters are natural. Whether you like it or not, they do happen. And these are like flood, earthquake, tsunami, etc. Others are technological. These are caused by human beings. These are human generated. I'm quite sure you can give a lot of examples of this. We have explosions, bombs explosions. We have experienced the heat of Twin Towers in US. We have experienced a lot of explosions. We have experienced people fighting. If you take weapons and fight others, you cause people to displace the population. These are technological, despite the fact. And some of these disasters are between the technological and the hybrid. These are called hybrid. Between natural and technological, they are called hybrid. And when you talk of hybrid, it can be maybe, for example, people are fighting. If they are fighting, people are running away from their country, they are displaced. When they are in a refugee settlement, the disease eruption from there can cause a disaster, because it can come a disease which that community cannot control of it. So if they cannot control, it means that these diseases were born in the cause of these people fighting maybe, or in the cause of this being displaced. These are called hybrid. Disease is the best to explain the hybrid situation of the disaster.